I make an appointment with a private neurologist. I go, I'm like, oh, this is private. Who should I pay? And he just says, oh, here you go. And I literally gave him like a wad of cash that he put in his pocket, which was just like,
Wow.
What?
yeah.
Like under the table.
I don't know.
Was this in New Zealand?
No, this was in the UK, and it was in
In-
a proper. I'm pretty sure he was a doctor. I could be wrong.
A backstreet
He might
doctor
have been a
in a dark
janitor.
alley. I
would've
can
been-
do an MRI.
I was like, I would have been, no, thank you.
I just need to do these invasive tests on you, Steve. You paid for it down a dark back alley.
Anna, our guest of the pod with terminal cancer, it's her discussions are even harder than ours because they'll be like, oh, you know what? She's like, oh yeah, I've got terminal cancer. And
yeah.
just the like stone. I was out at a bar with her and we were talking to some randos that we were chatting with. And she's like, oh yeah, terminal cancer. And everyone was very, had this kind of cheery, it was this really weird vibe that just kind of came over everything because that death had been mentioned.
Yeah. And like her acceptance of that, obviously, that's always going to be a hard thing to accept. But her acceptance of it, other people around her would want to show that same acceptance.
Yeah.
But they don't actually feel that. And so it's awkward because they're trying to be a way that they don't actually feel and nobody wants to.
That's the thing is there's this weird kind of ingenuineness that kind of creeps in because people just don't know what the fuck to say.
Oh, I think what's wrong with you is that you're 9, which is technically a degenerative brain disease.
But no, Thursday I've got that thing with Debbie, so...
With Debbie.
Debbie, what a bitch.
I know, yeah. I'll always plan an excuse to get out of time with Debbie.
Ugh, she's the worst. Every Debbie that's listened to this podcast is now personally offended.
Yeah, screw you, Debbie.
If you're listening, get fucked.
Yeah, we don't like you, Debbie.
Oh my God, that's so mean. We're horrible.
Yeah, she was asking for it. She's asking for it.
She's one of those people who is like morally okay to dunk on.
Yeah, and her family.
And her family. Well, I know a nice woman named Debbie. Like, anyway.
Really?
So for people who haven't been able to tell, Debbie's not real. We tend to take the piss a lot and have relatively dark senses of humor. So dark, in fact, that there's a medium % chance that I will have to cut one of our conversations out of this and chuck it on the Patreon because it's
at least one. I think I probably know the one you're referring to, but
no, yeah. I was literally making up a Debbie. I was just talking shit.
I wasn't. My dad was here at the time and his visa had run out. He tried to get his visa extended because his daughter was about to die, but he wasn't allowed to stay in the country even though I was dying. Oof. And he had to go back to the UK. And I remember him coming to see me and on his last day, and they allowed me out of the ward to have he came with like fish and chips and a bottle of pop to go out into the hospital grounds, even though I was, in a wheelchair, couldn't really eat. But it was like our last bit of time together. And I remember as he left the ward, him giving me a hug, and he'll give me a hug, but he's not, a particularly emotional man. And I could feel his tears on my arm because he was saying his goodbyes.
Yeah.
And remembering that is really weird to know that he was in that state of mind because I was dying. You'd be dying and going, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed. This is awful.
And I've crashed my new car. How
I hope I die. Well, I feel sorry for this guy. This was all going on in the middle of the night, under and beside his bed.
Under and beside. I don't know which one's worse. I have this very vivid image of like the lights of coming in from the hallway, and it's dark in the ward, and you're just like on all fours with doctors around you, and you're like, there's no God.
Yeah, I think probably one of my most attractive moments. I think.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm slightly horny now.
As you should be.
As you all should be, dear listeners.
Well, I mean, someone on all fours crawling around your bed in the middle of the night, what's not sexy about that?
Whoa.
So Lewis had gone downhill, his vision was going, he was possessed by Satan. It was a rough day.
the initial box tick, if she had been like, oh, well, maybe we'll double check on that after your baby is born, and
Yeah.
then all of a sudden you don't have stage 3 cancer, you have stage 2 cancer, and it's 10% ductile, and you are no longer fucking dying because this
Yeah.
bitch ignored you.
There is that, because I did later find out that the initial tumor was the least aggressive of all of them. It was a stage 2 tumor, whereas all the other smaller, more aggressive stage 3 ones had come after.
Mm.
So
When you're saying about like anger and that, you must have been absolutely raging at that point. Drawing it back to me for a sec, you said something about the film that I made, and you told me about Lucy's reaction to that, and that felt kind of huge when you told me.
yeah, because I mean, this whole journey's been a part of her being since she was 5. So this is all she remembers is mum has cancer. We just carry on. Everyone's like, oh, how are the kids? And I was like, well, they're fine, because this is just part of their reality, and they know the inevitability of it. I mean, it doesn't sort of come up a lot, but I did look over at her at one point, and she was crying, and she grabbed my hand and hung on for dear life. And I looked over at her, and she just looked at me like, I know this is how you feel. And yeah, that was big, because it was kind of like an acknowledgement that even though we don't talk about it a lot, is that we are okay with it. And she does acknowledge what's happening. We're
Yeah,
not just ignoring
kind
it.
of kind of like really healthy in a sad way.
Yeah,
That she
exactly.
kind of tap into that.
Yeah.
And yeah, when you told me that, it was like, if there's no other reaction to that bit of footage, that the fact that it did that, that's massive. People tend not to hand me newborns anymore because, you know,
You
dropping
might throw one at
babies.
the wall.
I initially went to a local GP who specifically was a female who I knew had just had breast surgery. So I figured she'll definitely take this seriously, because there's something really not right going on here. I initially had a lump in my boob about the size of, I don't know, the marshmallow Easter eggs that you get at Easter time. It's about that size. Felt
Right.
like that, the texture of that.
Was that the very start of your cancer journey?
Yeah.
Was that right?
Yeah. So I was 35, and so I mean, of course, that also doesn't get taken seriously, and all through the whole journey was just like, well, you're too young for this to be happening, but it
Yes,
is.
yeah.
So I went to her and I said, look, I've got this really uncomfortable, very quite large lump. It was technically sort of under my arm. And she patted me on the knee and said, oh dear, that's just what happens when you're a woman.
So the pair of you are rubbish, and do you have to, as the parent, be okay?
Yeah, I have to be like, he got up
Yeah.
and he was making his own breakfast. And I was like, I should probably make your breakfast.
This is
hungry.
one good reason to not that I don't have children is you can't have a day off, you can't call in sick to your children, and also me holding a newborn isn't necessarily the best idea. People tend not to hand me newborns anymore because, you know, dropping
might throw one at
babies,
the wall.
it might not necessarily just be a nice easy drop. Yeah, it might be a full on spaz and just chuck them. And if they're people who aren't expecting it, yeah, I'm just like, throw a baby. That's frowned upon, I think. Day to day, they're, you know, that invisible disability, but we do have the moments of, hey, look how fucked I am. So like when I have a seizure, people can see that things are wrong. And so we get that sympathy and we get that support and we get that sort of awareness and we can talk about stuff. But for people who are suffering with mental illnesses and mental issues and, you know, full-time stress, they don't get that support because they would have to go, hey, look, I'm having a problem. And that's hard to say. And so all these doctors and nurses, they came to try and stop this nutter from hiding under this bed. And I remember sort of crawling around, but then lashing out so they couldn't get me. And I was hitting like the blood pressure machines over and slapping their hands away. And really fighting from getting out into this bed. And eventually they got me out. And I remember being on all fours with a circle of doctors and nurses, also on all fours, all looking at me. And it was like, you know, in a standoff, like a fight. And I saw the doctor, I remembered his name was Hugh, and he was in front of me. And I said, Hugh, you're an educated man, right? And he said, yes. And so I shouted, well, you should know the difference between good and evil, and there's no such thing as God or the devil.